Welcome to Author Talk on CBSNews.com. We are joined today by Courtney Sullivan, author of the new novel Maine, a novel about family, a novel about 4 different women spread across 3 generations, a novel about Maine, or at least set in Maine.
That's right.
The inspiration for the book was what?
I started writing the book when I was at my best friend's family home in Maine on the beach, and the setup of that home is very similar, actually room for room recreation of the house in Maine, the book. There was an original cottage built by her great-grandfather in the 30s, and now there's a very modern house next door, and the relatives kind of split their time between these 2 houses. And I just love the idea of sort of the summer house that people go to generation after generation as the setting for this sort of family drama. And I also borrowed from them this idea of the 2 houses side by side and what that sort of comes to represent.
And it's a gorgeous sounding house, the original house at least, in the book, and it really is part of this family.
Absolutely. It's almost, as much of a person as any of them. It's kind of a character unto itself in the book.
Some of the things I've seen or read about the book, and the parts that I've seen myself, you talk about some of these characters having nothing in common other than the fact that they're just all part of the same family.
Yes, absolutely. And
they have to get along, for better or worse. Do they get along?
They don't always get along. I don't know if you've ever vacationed with your extended family, but
I have.
So when you vacation with your extended family, exactly. It can bring out the best and the worst, but it definitely is kind of this immersion course in your own relatives. And that was another reason why I wanted to put them all together at the family beach house, where they kind of can't get away from one another. With my first novel, Commencement, I was writing about a group of friends. And with this one, I wanted to take it kind of up to the next level. What happens when the people who aren't necessarily getting along so well are related? What do you do with that? And I think there's this kind of amazing elastic quality to family relationships where they just kind of get stretched and stretched, and you're thinking, this time it's all going to fall apart. But it doesn't. It just kind of goes back into its original place.
Well, talking about the family that gets stretched and stretched, you're obviously talking here potentially about dozens and dozens of characters. What made you limit it to these 4 women?
When I first started writing it, there were maybe 10 or 12 different family members telling their own stories, and they ranged in age from 5 to 85. But through the process of writing it, these 4 women really kind of rose to the top. And I think that's because Maggie, the granddaughter, and Alice, her grandmother, are kind of these generational bookends. They kind of mark the 2 ends of the family. And then in between them, you have Kathleen and Anne Marie, who are about the same age, and they have sort of taken what's been given to them and gone off in wildly different directions. So these 4 women were kind of the most different in a way. And then through them, the other characters in the family sort of get to come to life as well.
Did the writing process here take you to places you didn't expect?
Absolutely. Alice, the grandmother in the novel, who is kind of a dark and stormy character, to say the least.
She's a fascinating old sort of wine-soaked character.
She is wine-soaked indeed. She started out as kind of a cookie-cutter, very sweet grandmother, and she went off in a totally different direction and really took on a life of her own. And also this issue of the house and what happens with the house wasn't original to the story, but it kind of came along as I was writing.
You talk about Boston a bit as well.
That's right.
Or we see references to Boston, many of them in the book. You're from Boston yourself?
Yes.
Or at least outside Boston?
Yes.
How did that factor into what you wrote, and how much time had you spent in Maine? You talk about spending some time at a friend's place.
I don't think I've spent a single summer of my life not going to Maine. I've always go for at least a week, maybe a little bit more. There's this great restaurant in Agunquit called Barnacle Billy's. I don't know if you've ever been there, but
I've been to Agunquit. I'm trying to think if I've been to Barnacle Billy's.
You've probably been there. It's right in Perkins Cove. It's wonderful. And my family, because Boston is so close to that part of Maine, we would often just drive out for the day. We would go and grab dinner at Barnacle Billy's, go to the beach, and then go home. So that town in particular is so near and dear to my heart, and I know it so well. And same with Boston. So I really wanted to bring these real life places to life in the novel. I kind of toyed with the idea of making it a fictional town and with fictional shops and restaurants, but actually I decided it would be better to use the real places.
You write about an Irish Catholic family, something you're clearly familiar with.
Indeed.
How many of the characters are real life stories?
Well, it's funny, when I was touring around for commencement, my first novel, I had this big family dinner with all of my relatives in Boston when I was doing my book tour there. And one of my uncles stood up and gave this lovely speech saying how proud everyone was of me. And then they knew I was writing Maine, of course, at that time. And so he said, and we have to get this all on the table now, because a year from now, none of us will be speaking to you anymore. So my family was very aware, you know, that this book was being written. Because I don't want to be disowned, I would never base a character directly on any one person. But certainly a lot of stories from my family have made their way into the book. And I come from, you know, a big Irish family of storytellers. So I've heard the same tales many, many times over.
Is it problematic? I mean, does that fray the bonds? Because they clearly have to know at times that you're talking about them, and they're not always the most upstanding of characters.
Right. My family's been tremendously generous
Nothing against
about
your family
it. No,
at all.
But my family's been very generous about it. One of my aunts said to me, you know, if I'm going to be a character in this book, can you at least make me look good in a bathing suit? That was her only criteria, and otherwise they've really kind of let me go with it, which is very generous.
I have to say that having a family dinner or family holiday at the Sullivan table would probably be a fascinating trip and a fascinating visit.
Indeed.
What's up next for you?
I'm working on a novel now about 4 marriages, and it spans sort of the last century in America. So once again, I'm in this formula of 4 characters. It seems to be where I always naturally end up. But this time the characters don't know each other as they do in commencement and in Maine, so it's a little bit different.
You find it easier to deal with 4 characters as opposed to just one protagonist kind of leading you through it, just the way it ends up?
Every time I start out, I think, okay, there's just going to be 1. But then with Maine, there were 10, and then it got narrowed down to 4. And with this one I'm doing now, there are 5. But I have a feeling one of them might land on the cutting room floor. So it seems like it just ends up that way. And partly it's because I'm just fascinated by the idea of sort of perspective and perception, how we think we're viewed within the group versus how everyone else actually sees us. And giving these different viewpoints kind of allows you to see what everybody thinks of a given situation or a given person within the group.
How long do you take for a book, and what's your typical writing routine?
I think commencement took me about 3 years. Maine took about 2 years. And I now write full-time, write fiction full-time. So I go to a wonderful writing space in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Writer Space, and it's wonderful. It's silent. You can just kind of sit. Oh yeah, I go
all day.
Well, it depends. You know, I don't necessarily go at a set time, but as soon as I'm there, I'm there for the duration. I'm there for the long haul. I find it very hard to get started with writing, and I'll kind of take any excuse to do anything else. But once I'm there in the chair, focused in the zone, I'll write for 8 hours, and it will feel like it's been 2.
Do you have an internet connection there, or is that
Well, it's funny because when I joined, they asked me, do you want the internet password? And I said, you know, sure. And then they said, well, do you think you can really handle it?
Yeah.
And sadly, I took it. I wish I hadn't. But now I've just learned about this thing, Freedom, where you can install it on your computer and you can say, don't let me be on the internet for whatever amount of time. So I'm starting to use that.
Interesting. All right, Courtney Sullivan, author of Maine, your second novel.
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And good luck with the book.
Thank you.
You've been watching Author Talk on CBSNews.com.